Assalamu alaikum. Sarin tamam वचन वालन वतन पेन ऑनलाइन फैमिली हिंद तरफ पुर खुलूस सलाम तो दुआ मोहतरम नाजरीन उम्मीद छ तो ये ठीक पठन तो आज छ मीट द स्कॉलर सीरीज यत कन तो मज वारियान लुकन ये पाय आस कि हर दे में आतवार छ कोशिश करान कि कशीर पेठन यम ते लुक रिसर्च या तहकीक छ करान इस जुड़ो तिमन सतन तो यम ती मसबत रिसर्च करान या तहकीक करान कशीर पेठन तो इमन सतन इमन निशन जानो कि हज रिसर्च क्या सह क्या बना पन्ने कशीर हिंदिस बारस मज अतकन लुकन या अतकन मुख्तलिफ यम अस नुख्त तिमन हिंदन बारन मज तो तम निशन निमो अस पन लर्निंग या पन लेसन निमो अस तम निशन तो अति सिलसिलस मज अजुक सोन मीट द स्कॉलर प्रोग्राम तो यथ मज अस जुड़ो यम अख रिसर्चर यम तारीख दान यमन नाव डीन अकार्डी यम हिस्टोरियन चूंकि यम दीन यम करान कशीर मुतलिक कशीर हिंदिस तारीखस मुतलिक इहज रिसर्च लल देद तिहुंद पीरियड युस तथ पेठन यमो काम करमच या इस्लामुक पीरियड युस कशीर शुरू गो तथ पेठन इहुंद काम तो आज जुड़ो इहज अख रिसर्च पेपर तथ पेठन करो यमन सतन कथ चूंकि डीन अंग्रेज पेठन कथ करान इसीलिए अजुक प्रोग्राम पे अंग्रेज पेठन करुन तो अमिक कतई मतलब या मकसद कि अस पन्ने जबान मज आइंदस प्रोग्राम करें कि अस पन्ने जबान पेठन फख्र सह सन पहचान सह सन हकीकत करान अलबत्ता कुछ सातन ये मौके ये थोड़ा सा पेवान तब्दीली कर चूंकि हज काम ज्यादा अहम इसीलिए यमन से जुड़न ज्यादा अहम तो यमन से जुड़न खतर पे अंग्रेज जबान हूं इस्तेमाल कर तो यम सन नाजरीन पसंद करान काशिर पे बोजन तो तिमन मोदबाना मुआजरत करान प्रोग्राम खतर तो बे सन कोशिश कि यम ते अहम नुख्त प्रोग्रामस मज वातन तिम वातनावो तुह तामत काशिर पे यूत व त्यूत जल्दी करो हतुल इम्कान कोशिश तम चीज Now, coming on to today's program, I'm sure that we'll have many English-speaking audiences also with us. So a very warm welcome and thank you to all of them. And yeah, you could send us your comments, your feedback, and your questions on our social media handles today. And we'll be live on Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. And yeah, you could like us and subscribe our channels. And a very warm welcome to you, Dean. How are we today?
I am all right. How are you?
Well, very well. Thank you very much. Indeed, truth be told, I'm really excited to learn, rather engage with you regarding your work. So the questions are too many because I went through your paper and the clock's ticking. So I'll straight away come on to the first question for the day. How did you first come to know about Lal Ded? How was this experience and what drew you towards this kind of research that we are engaging with on today?
Sure. Well, I became interested in Lal Ded shortly before I entered my graduate school program. I was working at the University of Pennsylvania Library and had already had an interest in religious traditions in Kashmir, and by chance happened to stumble across a couple of books reshelving them that were on Lala and her, how she was revered both by Hindus and Muslims, and that she's a woman and an ascetic, and all of this together made me very interested in who she is and how she appeals to different people. So when I entered into my master's degree, I in fact was interested in studying her and understanding her poetry and so on and so forth. But as you know from my article, as I dug further, the studying of her poetry became more fraught when examined historically. And so I decided to shift gears to look at the earliest writings about her and to try to understand how we have come to understand her as we do today, and how that may be similar to or differ from how she was understood earlier near her to her life.
Well, indeed, that's very interesting. So if I talk about your paper, in your paper, you basically contend the current presentation or depiction of Lal Ded, so much so that in your paper, you use the word distortion of Lal Ded, or even the Hindu-Muslim collective identity. Could you tell us a little bit about this contention that you raise in your arguments?
Yeah, so I mean, there's kind of two components to it. So one is digging into the archive, and I would say most of the time that I've seen her represented in literature and scholarship, that she is almost always marked first and foremost as a Hindu or at least a Shaiva, and that then she was a Shaiva woman saint who was then revered by Muslims and in the more, I would say, difficult or Orientalist scholarship, that she is depicted as having been Hindu and then co-opted by the Muslim communities in Kashmir. And when I started digging into the archives, I found that that was not the case, that in fact the earliest archival evidence that I could find of Lala was that she was written about by Muslims, by members of different Sufi orders, but especially the Suhrawardi Sufi order in Kashmir, and that only later do we see her poetry appear hundreds of years later in written form. So there's always the argument that this was orally passed down, but that is very hard, especially as a historian, to affirm. But we can get into that later, but that her poetry appears later, whereas the earlier accounts of her are actually hagiographical in the sense of stories about her instead of being things that she said. And so for me, it seemed like an inverse of what we typically thought about as far as Lala was concerned, that she, instead of being a Hindu Shaiva saint, first revered by her own community and then revered by Muslims and written about by different Sufi hagiographers. Instead, stories about her came first, and then her poetry appears later. So that made me very concerned about especially the ways in which people would then check stories about her to see, oh, is this an accurate story about her or not, on the basis of, does it reflect what is said in her own voice in her poetry? Whereas if the stories came first, there's a possibility that poetry was written on the basis of stories about her rather than the other way around.
Well, yeah, absolutely. It depicts some level manifestly of this inversion, where what comes first has to depict or influence what comes later, whereas in this case, it's the other way around. There's a reversal of those things. Now, when I talk about this reversal, your work talks about George Grierson and Lionel Barnett's book, Lalla Vakiani, which they did by the assistance of Mukund Ram Shastri. But when I talk about your work, it argues in that their work, it recasted Laldet and the cultural heritage of Kashmir as exclusively Hindu. And on that thing, you call it a sordid strategy, which is a very significant statement indeed. Would you like to shed some light on that?
Yes, absolutely. So one of the difficulties with the Grierson publication, as well as the situation around Mukund Ram Shastri, is that very little is revealed in the publication of the Lalla Vakiani about the process, or in fact, they do talk a lot about the process, but don't talk about significant parts of it which would challenge the way that they've talked about the process of publishing this. So on the one hand, that Mukund Ram Shastri was a chief pundit in the research and publications department of the Dogra princely court, and so that already colors the positioning of those involved, and also that Grierson and Barnett were both famed Orientalists of the time. Grierson a bit more complicated in as far as many of us know that Grierson really became famous because of the Linguistic Survey of India, and so was much more interested in vernacular languages, more contemporary spoken languages than Sanskrit, which was the primary interest of most Orientalists, whether were in Sanskrit texts and this kind of uncovering of some ancient way of being, religious traditions, so on and so forth in South Asia as somehow the kind of core civilization. And of course, this circulated in late 19th and early 20th century notions of nationality, nationhood, civilization, peoples, and you can read the implications of race and ethnicity into those types of assertions. And so trying to find Lala as a kind of spokesperson of Kashmiri people, and then to say that she is a kind of a figure of Kashmir, but is Hindu and is focused on this time period that is pre-Muslim or early Muslim period, is a choice then, and a very, in my opinion, a very pointed choice, especially for Grierson, who in his linguistic survey of India and included Kashmir, talks about the Muhammadan Kashmiri versus the Hindu Kashmiri, and that the Hindu Kashmiri is pure and correct and tied to Sanskrit and so on and so forth, whereas the Muhammadan is borrowing from Persian. It's not said, oh, the Pandit Kashmiri is borrowing from Sanskrit. Somehow that's natural in his description, whereas Muslims are considered lesser, borrowing, and other types of derogatory notions towards Kashmiri Muslims as rendering them unreliable as not only sources, but also as anyone attesting anything regarding Kashmir and Kashmiri culture.
So that's very interesting, Dean, indeed. So it's a sort of a reappropriation or reconstruction as part of this Orientalist or any other project that could have been running. If I may ask you here, what was the identity of Lala before these or projects like these? For instance, for the learned people or the general masses of the 16th or 17th centuries, how did they know Lala in terms of this identity?
Yes, and so this, I mean, of course, in a certain way, working on an pre-modern period, in which there's much less evidence, it's hard to say who Lala was as a person on the ground. In fact, that is a difficult thing to get at. Likewise, that so much of the counter arguments to what I've been talking about will focus back to her poetry, which was then supposed to be orally passed down for hundreds of years before it was written down. So I raise doubts about that, but it is hard to affirm whether, which case is true, because every time anyone says, oh, we found an earlier manuscript of Lala, I look at it immediately and then find, no, that's not an earlier manuscript of Lala. We can, dig into that. I am open to the idea that that there could be earlier manuscripts, and I would love to look at them, but I've yet to find one that dates earlier than these early Stein manuscripts, and at the earliest sometime in the late 1600s. Once again, it's hard to date them because they're not dated, but nevertheless, I think the aim of your question is to say, how was she understood at the time? Well, that she was celebrated as amongst these Sufi groups as a saint of Kashmir, that she is a figure that is oddly not necessarily said to be a Muslim, but at the same time is said to, when various saints visit Kashmir, she interacts with them in a way that shows evidence of her having divine knowledge or having an advanced or elevated spiritual state, such that one story about her and Makhdum Jahaniya ascending the heavens and reaching the throne of God, and whatnot, shows that they are putting her within an Islamic imaginary, in as far as, not to say it's imaginary, but that like in a way of thinking, the universe, the cosmology, that she is said to engage in them. At the same time, they never say, oh, and she was a Muslim. It's instead that identity is more amorphous when it comes to her. And I think that fits into larger arguments that these Sufi groups are trying to make regarding Kashmir and Kashmiri identity, and how religion works on the ground, and how maybe spiritual beings in Kashmir are participating in an Islamic universe even before Islam makes an appearance in Kashmir. But that's a much larger issue. But she's nevertheless a figure that is emblematic of Kashmir as a native Kashmiri figure, at the same time is seen as interacting extensively with and integrated into stories of other Sufi saints in order to both validate and or make her an important figure to elevate their figures, so to speak.
All right. So that's very interesting. This sort of gives a very nuanced understanding of Lala, if I may say, because compared to these Orientalist projects, which actually project her to be exclusively Hindu and revolve the other things around that, this gives a rather more secularistic kind of identification of Lala. And when you talk about these writings or depiction of Lala, your work or your research talks about Muhammad Ali Rana's Tazkiratul Arifin of 1587 AD. And you argue that to be the first written account, or must I say, hagiography of Lala. Could you run us a little through that? Like, how do they depict Lala in that, if you could say something?
Sure, yes. So as far as I've been able to find, that appears to be the first true writings about Lala are in the Tazkiratul Arifin, and that she is, there are other earlier accounts in which they talk about a kind of mystical woman and whatever, other sorts of things, but identified as Lala, this is the earliest that I could find. And that she is identified as a majzub, somebody who is, a saint who is focused entirely upon the divine, and such that other desires fall away. And that she is, the stories told about her are that she is, I guess it's a question of which stories you want me to speak about, but one of them that's significant is that she's said to extensively interact with Makhdoom Jahaniya, such that they have a kind of rapport that of mutual respect, such that later on, when Hamza Makhdoom is born, that she is there at spiritually at his birth, and then functions as a Sufi master, teaching him techniques of the Suhuwardi order passed on to her by Makhdoom Jahaniya, but taught to him from the spiritual realm. So this is a significant thing that in many ways, because Makhdoom Jahaniya was so revered and considered a major saint in the Suhuwardi order, that just through the regular, disciplic lineage of Hamza Makhdoom, it would be a few generations away, but if she can function as an immediate link passing on traditions, that makes Hamza Makhdoom's subs saintliness and practices even more valid and even more pronounced. And so Lala functions in that way for them. But also there's stories of her encountering a lion in the forest and turning them into a majzub, such that that they no longer desire to eat the sheep and whatnot and goats that are brought through the forest. So she's given kind of other miraculous tales, but she's clearly marked as somebody who has incredible knowledge of the saints of her time, and is able to, in many ways, assess who are the best saints and most powerful saints, and who are lesser saints. And in some ways, I believe gender functions in this, that there's a kind of masculinity, especially amongst ascetic saints, that they are marked as being more spiritually advanced due to their asceticism, whereas Lala, because she is a woman, becomes an arbiter of her of saintliness, because she's kind of not ranked alongside them. And that's why I think this putting her in this liminal position where they're not saying, oh, she's a Muslim of a particular Sufi order who then, then she would be in the running, instead of functioning as an arbiter, that then you can have her say, oh, this person is more powerful than another. So that's a way in which she's functioning in Reina's Tazkiratul Arifin.
Yeah, so that's more of a hagiographic account, and compared to what was given by particularly Grierson and Barnett's work, where it's more poetic, which revolves around Sanskritization and other things, and like characterizes her into sort of wild, feminine, and a whole body of Hinduism. So, how would you, in short words, how would you nuance these two depictions, the depiction that we get before this Orientalist project of Grierson and Barnett, and compared to the project that, not the project, but compared to the depiction that we see in these Persian texts or these Tazkiras?
Well, I would say that what Grierson and Barnett do with Lalla was not entirely new to them. It seems like she had already been co-opted within a more Hindu Shaiva milieu, as shown in these manuscripts that Orelstein collected, upon which Grierson and Barnett based a lot of their poetic corpus that they put together of her poetry. But there's a way in which even the Shaiva depictions of her are then placed within a scheme that Orientalists were definitely working with trying to relate it back to the Rajataranganis, trying to relate it back to what they see as Hindu scriptures and yogic practices and so on and so forth, which is kind of reveals more about the interests and or obsessions of Orientalists at the time than it might reveal about Lulla's legacy before that. But if you even look, so you see this, depiction of her kind of fitting into some Kashmir Shaiva version of Hindu religiosity in Kashmir in the 17th, 18th century. But even before that, then we see Lalla as a kind of interesting figure that's like a saint, and that her sainthood is affirmed through her both her ascetic practices and her miracles that she is said to produce, and affirmed by other saints, pointing out that she is a saint. And so she's a saintly figure, and yet what particular identity that is, or what is the ultimate religious affiliation of her, is left very vague. And well, I could leave it there.
Yeah, and that vagueness is manipulated in different projects to give different context or color to that, like identity, for instance, what we are talking about, this Orientalist project, where this identity is actually given a very manifest color of Hinduism or Shaivism. Now, if I may talk about your work, where it builds upon or argues about Grierson's depiction of Kashmiri language, literature, and culture as solely derived and produced by Hindus drawn upon their Sanskrit ancestry, literary ancestry. And you very interestingly equate it to be tantamount to this intentional erasure of centuries of Kashmiri Muslim cultural production. Would you like to shed some light on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is and this is an issue with Orientalist scholarship of the time in general, is that I would say a predilection or a larger, if we were to look at Said and his writings about Orientalism, that Orientalists are invested in projects connected with colonialism and imperialism, and that the part of the Orientalist project in South Asia was to connect Indic civilization to Sanskrit and those traditions, partly because Europeans discovered that this connection between European and Indic languages through the study of Sanskrit, and so Indo-European becomes this big thing, which then, from a kind of linguistic category becomes some sort of ethnographic racial category that leads to Aryanism and World War II and all that sort of stuff. And so Grierson and Barnett are within this world, whereas Muslims are considered outsiders, Semitic, maybe Persian, which then is somehow more acceptable to them than Arab Muslims. But the idea that Muslims are native to not only Kashmir, but South Asia more generally, it fits into a narrative that I would say that a kind of soft Hindutva today says, which is either you're Muslims are either foreigners or they are converts. If they're foreigners, they should go back to where they came from, or if they were converts, then they should convert back to their native religion, Hinduism or something like that. So it very easily feeds into this notion, and obviously very easily feeds into what the Dogra court was trying to do at the time, which is to legitimize their rule over Kashmir, despite the actual history being the Dogras bought rulership over Kashmir by turning against their overlords in the Sikh Empire and assisting the British. And so they don't have a kind of legitimacy of rulership over Kashmir, especially since they wanted to maintain their Hindu identity. And so they instead wanted to make the locus of Kashmiri heritage, culture, and identity to the pre-Islamic or a time before Muslims were in Kashmir. And so to play up these times, which were called, like many Orientalists or others even will call it, the kind of golden age of Kashmir, this 9th, 10th century, when Abhinavagupta was around and these Shaiva traditions were being developed and so on and so forth, which are fascinating. And Abhinavagupta is brilliant. But to make that the kind of moment of Kashmiri identity functions to erase anything after that. And that it's clear that Grierson, because of working on Kashmiri English dictionaries, because of working on linguistic survey, and because of their research, knows that there's a massive amount of Persian scholarship, poetry, that the Muslim intellectual traditions in Kashmir are vast. And so to kind of reinforce this notion that, like, oh, once Muslims came, it's all, it's kind of a dark age in Kashmir, is to play into this Orientalist notion that Muslims are foreigners and unproductive and not even truly Kashmiri. And this has major implications at the time as well as for today.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And about this Dogra project, we'll come on to it a little later. Here, I again want to revolve around Grierson's work, where like they intentionally, again, they dismiss or mute the influence that these Sufi saints or these Sufi orders would have had on Laldet or Lalla. So what does your work say about that? What were the kind of strategies or the kind of preemptive strategies that they took in their research or in their work to mute this influence that the Sufis or Sufi orders would have had on Laldet, to present her to be exclusively Hindu?
Sure, and it's a bit complicated. You can look at it more in the article itself, where I get into more detail. But part of it is that already working under the assumption that that Hinduism precedes Islam, that Sanskrit precedes vernacular languages, and so on and so forth. That then and that also that Lalla, you must privilege her words over accounts about her, that then they function in this way to say, oh, okay, so first we take Lalla's poetry, and then we then look at, and that is a true representation of herself, for whatever reason, that they take this as functioning in that way, which then makes it so that any accounts about her are seen as secondary or derivative, or can be affirmed or said to be fabricated as a result of how well it aligns with the poetry. And this fits into, once again, these kind of, because her poetry kind of uses more Sanskritically derived terms. But of course, this becomes a favoritism as well, because when they look at the poetry, how do they assess whether a poem is an authentic Laldet poem versus an kind of addition, a later accretion to her poetry? Would be upon the grounds of, oh, is there a Persian term used? Or is it more Sanskritic? Those are more reliably hers because Sanskrit comes before Persian, so on and so forth. So this kind of self-affirming way in which then what can be assessed as what is truly Lalla's is Sanskritic, which then allows them to assert that Kashmiri culture and Lalla is Hindu and Sanskritic. It affirms itself, and so therefore functions in a way to then deny all these other accounts as saying, oh, these were just later fabrications, or people came, or in a nice way, oh, people came to revere her too, and therefore wrote these things about her. But those are not, reliable.
Absolutely. So now, taking a little bit of a shift from Grierson and Barnett, I've been coming on to Mukund Ram Shastri, the principal research assistant. Like, he collected the poems for them, he sent them the commentaries and all. How does your work see him and the credence of his work? Because I went through the investigation that you did, like, wherein they claim that he was appointed or hired in 1914, but then you have a look at his personal letters that he exchanged with Grierson, that he was already working on the project since 1911 at least. So how do you, or your work, how does it look at Mukund Ram Shastri and the credence of his work?
Yeah, so it's a messy ordeal, and it was something that I did not expect to come upon, except for going through the British Library and its and the papers of Grierson, within which you can find letters between Mukund Ram Shastri and Grierson, and it is a much more sordid situation. So everything from, and this is a hard part for me, because Mukund Ram Shastri, in many ways, I have a lot of sympathy for him, because he got the short end of the stick in many ways too. So that Jagdish Chandra Chatterjee was an early, the head of the research and publications department, and he was a Bengali, and we could talk about why Bengali Brahmins got privilege in the Dogra court. That's a whole other interesting situation. But that Mukund Ram Shastri, as well as other Kashmiri Pandits, were kind of secondary in the rank of order of importance. And then you find, so there's two controversial things as you kind of bring up. First is that Mukund Ram Shastri was clearly kind of hired as a research assistant to collect these poems, as well as provide kind of critical commentary and notes on them, and give them to Grierson for then Grierson to publish ultimately. And that Mukund Ram Shastri obviously providing translations. So in some ways, to say that Grierson and Barnett were the ones to translate is, typical Orientalist move of erasing the people who did the real work. But that Mukund Ram Shastri collected over 300 poems and gave notes and so on and so forth, and then and collected them and kept them in his home, because this was a side project, so he wouldn't keep it in the office. And then his home burned down, and he lost all of it. And this is a terrible, tragedy for him. But as you can imagine, also Grierson and Barnett are frustrated that they're like, oh, we paid you for all this work and all the work is gone. So sympathetic other Orientalists or friends of the empire that were in Kashmir kind of beg Grierson to be like, oh, give a larger stipend to him, let him kind of continue. This wasn't his fault, so on and so forth. So then he goes out and tries to recollect as many poems as he can, and comes up with this, this much smaller, just over 100 poems of Lala's, and then and submits them, because a number of his sources of oral tradition have died since he collected them the first round. And so he can only collect so many. He does write those commentaries and sends them to Grierson. But in Grierson and Barnett's ultimate publication, all of this is erased. They imply over and over again that this is a solid corpus of Lala's poetry, and that if nothing else, that we can't know exactly what her poems are at a time, but these are reliable. We know that these are solid. There's a way in which they imply that this is almost like a critical edition of her poetry, or at least one kind of edition, like how other kind of Orientalist scholars working on Sanskrit will then find, like, oh, this is this edition of the Mahabharata and that edition and so on and so forth. This is an edition of Lala's poetry. But it's just what Mukund Ram Shastri could recollect in the short period of time under a deadline. So that's one side of it. The other major point is that in the Dogra court, there was chaos happening, because Jagdish Chandra Chatterjee had embezzled massive amounts of funds from the court and did not publish almost anything in that time, and then fled I remember in the archives seeing speculation that they might have fled to Chennai, to Madras, or connected with the Theosophical Society or something, but it was all speculation because they couldn't find him. And so therefore couldn't bring him to court. So the underling, Mukund Ram Shastri, was then put into the position that Jagdish Chandra had before, but also was made to make up for his previous boss's misdeeds by publishing as much as possible, and selling as much as possible, and also making sure that what is published is as beneficial to the Dogra court as possible, which means focus on the Sanskritic traditions, focus on the Hindu traditions, things that would promote Dogra legitimacy in its rule over Kashmir. So Mukund Ram is between these two very bad positions, that the court is being terrible to him, and Grierson and Barnett are frustrated that his house burnt down and therefore they lost what they wanted, which shows a certain inhumanity too. I mean, Grierson was sympathetic, did send the money, but also you can see the frustration of being like, but the work, instead of saying, your assistant is in dire straits. That should come first. But yeah, all of this is erased or obfuscated in the ultimate publication of Grierson and Barnett's, which is a major problem.
Is there any addition to this, like, because you mentioned, rather you emphasized the word that he did this collection in his spare time. So you talk about these two things, that his house burned down, and in the department, like when Chatterjee fled away, he had this load where he had to produce this work. Is that the sole reason that you call that he did it in his spare time? And how does it like impact the quality and credence or credibility of the work that he collected? For instance, like after the work burned down, most of the collection of these poems that he did was from Dharamdas Darwish, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. So what does it say about the credibility of the kind of work that they produced?
Right. So as I mentioned before, because of the pressures of the court and that he became the head of the research and publications department, and so therefore had to produce so much, that this was supposed to be Sanskrit works, and especially very Hindu Sanskrit works from this, pre-Islamic period, was what he was supposed to focus on, making critical editions and publishing. And so working on Lala, whose poetry is in Kashmiri, and therefore is of much less of a priority for the Dogra court. But this is a commission. So, and you can just say, thinking about how the money's working, that he has a job with the Dogra court for which he's being paid. And then there is Grierson and Barnett paying Mukund Ram to do work. And so he can't do this on, company time. So he's doing this in his spare time, in time that he has outside of doing the work that he's doing for the court. Now, I do mention that after this seems to go well, the Grierson and Barnett, publishing the Lala Vakyani is taken well, that as soon as that happens, they publish in the Kashmir texts, KSTS, Kashmir Studies and Text, I'm messing it up, but that series that they publish Lala's poems. And so Mukund Ram churns out another publication on his spare time work, which I think we're all familiar with, of like, oh, you did something in your spare time, but it might actually be able to work for your main work. He takes advantage of that, but yes, he's not doing it during regular working hours. And relies heavily upon one source at that point, who is a kind of traditional reciter of Lala poetry.
Yeah, absolutely. So this entire, first he collects from many sources, his house burns down, then it's reduced to 109 poems only, and one of the major contributors is just one person. So with regard to that, having those things in mind, can we really say that this is a critical edition of Lalit's poems? What does your work say about this? And then how is this thing, like this production of Lala Vakyani, how do you claim or argue in your work it to be related to this Orientalist project and that of the Dogra Code as well?
Yeah, so the reliability of it as a critical edition is I mean, and as far as you could say, any, if you went to, meet somebody who is a famous, performer of Kabir poems, you could say, oh, all the poems and that person recites can be a critical edition of that person, so to speak. But to say it's a critical edition as if this is an embodiment of something from the 14th century is very difficult to assert at all. Also, that it's clear that, and it's a interesting, you can imagine the battles that each of these scholars are dealing with at the time. So Grierson, being someone who's interested in vernacular poetry or the vernacular religions and poetry that are not in the Sanskritic world, he is working against a field that has a strong preference for the Sanskritic, both things written in Sanskrit, but also kind of fits in within that milieu. And so Grierson is trying to argue for the validity of these poems of Lalla that are in Kashmiri on the basis of, oh, well, we found a manuscript. Oral Stein has 2 manuscripts of Lalla's poetry, seemingly from either the late 17th or early 18th century. And that these poems, so therefore if the poems that are being recited are also in these manuscripts, that shows that they're reliable, which for me might show that, oh, well, it also might mean that they read the manuscripts, or maybe not those manuscripts, but there might have been other manuscripts at the time. So sure, it might be that this is a critical edition of poems from the 18th century, but that doesn't get us any closer to Lalla, and certainly not any closer than the earlier hagiographies from the end of the 16th century. So this is to kind of, once again, assert that these poems are the kind of bedrock, the stone upon which we can test all of the other sources, is backwards and problematic. And as far as fitting into the Dogra court, you can imagine also who is it that you're going to for these poems. It's not like Muslims were not reciting poems attributed to Lalla. They were there, but for some reason they are not considered reliable because of all of the things I've been discussing, that they are somehow not reliable speakers because they're Muslims, or because Muslims only later accepted Lalla, and so on and so forth, that they're not considered sources, which is frustrating.
So ultimately, Lalla Vakhyani, it turns into an intentional kind of project that sort of attempts to Hinduize the identity of Kashmir. Okay, and it does influence the future kind of scholarship that was done on Lalla. Do you agree?
For sure, absolutely. And this is a frustrating part of this too. Of course, so some people have pointed out, like, oh, what else was the Dogra court going to do? They were in a kind of tight position, so they had to somehow legitimize their rule. And it's like, okay, well, but this was also working against assertions by, for example, Nicholas Dirks arguing in The Hollow Crown that all of these princely states were just kind of puppet rulers, and that the British were really the power behind the scenes. So to a certain degree, of course, the British are leering over the Dogras the whole time. At the same time, the Dogras had plenty of power to do all sorts of things, like where the money is going to go, and what type of research is going to be sponsored. And as we know about the Jammu massacres, that the Dogras had quite a lot of power, both culturally as well as militarily on their side. So we know that there is princely states have more power than sometimes people seem to attribute to them. In seeing the British as this major power, they had plenty of power and were asserting it, as Mridhu Rai points out very well in her book as well. So, yeah. So that it makes it so that later scholarship that then privileges this kind of Hindu version of Lalla, and that her poetry is what's key to all of it, and that what is of interest of Lalla is her poetry, kind of all builds on top of Grierson and Barnett's kind of Orientalist building of Lalla. There's been a number of scholars who have tried to move beyond that, but it has in many ways primed how we think about Lalla, as well as how I would say that it is interesting for me to see scholarships that asserts that the poetry that is attributed to Lalla tells us something about a woman's consciousness, way of thinking, way of being in the 14th century. There's no evidence that she wrote this or that even another woman wrote this. That, in my opinion, it seems more likely that the poetry attributed to Lalla were penned by elite Brahmin men, and then moved on from there. I mean, that's a total speculation, but I would say, given who is writing things and writing manuscripts, especially manuscripts that are within a codex of other Sanskrit texts at the time, which is where these Stein manuscripts are found, are within larger codex of Sanskrit texts, there's more likelihood that this is a Brahmin man's writing in the voice of Lalla than it is an authentic voice of Lalla herself. Now, that's fascinating, but we shouldn't attribute to them, certain kind of sociological categories and psychological categories that might not bear out.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Now, coming on to your work, it ends on a very interesting note. You don't reduce or you don't confine this misrepresentation and obfuscation to only these literary projects, but you collate it and depict that it has influenced the current predicament of Kashmir, the communal, national, and international kind of thing that's happening in Kashmir. Would you like to shed some light on that?
Sure. So, like how Edward Said argues with Orientalism more generally, that these things don't exist in scholarship alone, nor does scholarship exist in a void separate from larger social circumstances and cultural production. And so Lulla's, the legacy of Lulla then becomes, it seems that more and more, even, other Muslim scholars on this time period, whether on the Rishis or on Lulla herself, tend to also, even if they complicate it, there's a way in which the primacy of Lulla as a Shaiva saint and her poetry, that seems to often still build in there, although some are more resistant to it than others. But knowing that this is almost like, psychologically speaking, priming, that the first thing that's said, then after that, everything is measured against it. And if Grierson and Barnett's writings about Lulla becomes the kind of cornerstone of thinking about Lulla, then it seems like traditions are built up around that depiction, that Muslims that revere Lulla revere her oftentimes as a Hindu that also is to be honored because of her connection with various Sufi saints, which is unfortunate that she is not seen as maybe primarily connected to Muslim figures and saints and so on and so forth, because I think this depiction then leads to a deficit on both sides of a communal divide, that Kashmiri Hindus are robbed of a major figure that had extensive interactions with Muslims, at least to the earliest accounts, and that we should take those accounts seriously, not as a later accretion to her legend. But also for Muslims to then think, oh, she was nice, but she wasn't really interacting with Muslims on their own terms. But these early traditions do have that, so that she can function as a figure that's much more interestingly and handled in nuance about intercommunal interactions, that also doesn't necessarily fuel a kind of Kashmiriyat, and that's a whole other question around Kashmiriyat. People even want to say that she was like a proto-secular figure. I'm not sure what that means for the 14th century. It's a very difficult thing to argue about secularism then, but it's clear that there is a type of interaction that Lulla represents in these early texts that I think we could benefit from greatly if it weren't overshadowed by this later Orientalist configuration and shaping of Lulla as this Hindu primarily and secondarily may be revered by Muslims.
Well, yeah, thank you so very much, Dean. It actually depicts that, like, these scholarly misdemeanors, how they impact the kind of identities that were to be shaped in the future and the kind of predicament that the people and the lands had to face ultimately. How these things that were done in the past, which didn't look so so macabre, turned out to be macabre in the end because of what's actually happening right now and what we are caught into. And yeah, congratulations for the very wonderful work that you're doing, and we wish you all the best for the future work as well. Thanks a lot for your time, and we would definitely engage with you on your other works as well.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having this incredible program and for keeping this type of engagement going. I appreciate it.
It was really great to have you. Thanks a lot, Dean.
Thank you.